Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. Well, the long-awaited response to my video on Rob English's interview with Dr. Paul Saladino has finally dropped, and I have to say, it is an impressive technical production, complete with Pixar-level special effects and production values on par with films from the Marvel Shit-O-Matic universe. I guess this makes sense since it took 2 months to make. In fact, I gotta be honest, I actually almost totally forgot about Rob English. It had long since moved on to other subjects, but like a bad penny that keeps turning up, he has decided to make a point-by-point response to my response to his interview with professional anti-vegan troll Dr. Paul Saladino, complete with special effects, excerpts from Family Feud,
little mustache,
Hey, something.
and a lot of silent footage of me talking. No, that footage isn't sped up, that's actually how fast I really talk. But anyways, despite the top-notch production values, there are still a lot of problems with this video and with Rob English in general. But one thing I did like about this video is how Rob English structured it. He organized his arguments into a series of problems that he timestamped and put below in the description, so I thought I'd do the same thing and go over the many problems of Rob English. So let's begin. Problem 1. Rob English is royally butthurt that I question his diagnosis of androgenic alopecia.
Specifically, Kevin Mann creates a false narrative about my medical history.
Why is Rob English even bother trying to save his hair? He doesn't have androgenic alopecia. So as you can see, he's very upset that I question the validity of his androgenic alopecia diagnosis. It's true that a doctor diagnosed him at the age of 17, and contrary to what he's implying, I never denied that. In fact, in my video, I even showed an image of his doctor's diagnosis, and I'll show it again right here. At 17 years of age, he went to a hair transplant doctor with his mother, and the doctor did say he had some hair thinning, though his hairline was intact. He criticizes me for doubting his doctor's diagnosis, and he bases this on my confidence in doctors being able to accurately diagnose people with androgenic alopecia even in a short period of time. But then he undercuts his own argument by citing several papers documenting that doctors are in fact overworked and rushed, and that it is therefore hurting their ability to properly diagnose and treat their patients.
I think that the data suggests that doctors are overworked, they are burnt out, that patient interactions are too short, and that this compromises the quality of care, but who cares about that?
So if Rob English is so convinced that doctors are too overworked and that their diagnoses of patients are rushed, then why is it so implausible that maybe his doctor got it wrong when he diagnosed him with androgenic alopecia? Apparently, he has now lost confidence in his original doctor because he then claims that multiple doctors made the same diagnosis, but he provides no documentation for this. I mean, if his diagnosis was so certain, why would he keep seeing different doctors about it to confirm the diagnosis? So let's assume, anyways, that I'm wrong for a minute, and he really does have androgenic alopecia. Rob English said he started balding at the age of 17 years old. That would indicate that he has an extremely severe case of androgenic alopecia. You ask anyone who is completely bald in their 20s, and there is a very good chance they'll tell you that they started balding as teenagers. I consider my own case of androgenic alopecia to be pretty severe, but even I had a full head of hair when I was 17 years old. For example, here's a picture of me back in 1998 when I was 17 years old, and even though I still have a big forehead, I think I'm pretty much a Norwood 1 here. But anyways, I started balding in my early 20s, and there have been moments where due to issues like travel or forgetting to refill my prescription of finasteride, that I have been off finasteride for several weeks at a time. I can tell you with the utmost confidence that if I stop using finasteride for 5 weeks, I will start to lose ground. Rob English claims that he began his battle against hair loss in the year 2007, which is almost around the same time I began my own fight with hair loss, but I am 10 years older than Rob English, so you would think that his hair loss would be much more aggressive than mine, yet he's managed to maintain a perfect Norwood 1 hairline with absolutely zero signs of hair loss for the past 14 years using only scalp massages without any pharmacological help. This is going to make any hair loss veteran skeptical of his androgenic alopecia diagnosis, especially since the theory behind scalp massages, also known as the BLØDFLÜW theory, is completely bogus. Not just in practice, but even in theory, which don't worry, I fully intend to get into that later in the video. Of course, it's also possible he does have androgenic alopecia, and he's not telling us everything about his treatment protocols in order to use his own alleged personal success story to better market himself for his business. Now, I'm not sure that's the case, but if he really did start balding at 17 years old, as he claims, there is no way he stopped all that progression just from scalp massages and without any kind of pharmacological intervention. I know he says he used minoxidil, but it was only for a short period of time, so we know it can't be that. Now, I think my questioning of his diagnosis is what Rob was the most angry about in my video, and he later takes an opportunity to take a cheap shot at my own history fighting hair loss, which we'll get to in due course. But to be clear though, I am not doubting that his doctor really did diagnose him with androgenetic alopecia. Like I said, I did show his doctor's report on my video, but I am still entitled to my own opinion, and based on what I have seen, I am still skeptical doctor diagnosis or not. It's not like doctors never make mistakes. Even Rob knows this, which is why he mentioned how doctors being overworked interferes with their ability to perform their job well. In fact, this questioning of his diagnosis made Rob so upset with me that he even threatened to sue me. Here is a comment he left on my video about him. Problem 2. Rob English accuses me of being just in it for the money while neglecting to mention he himself makes money from his website.
Unless things have changed from earlier this year, Kevin Mann monetizes his channel. Moreover, Kevin Mann does not make himself accessible to people seeking his advice on hair loss outside of his YouTube channel.
Rob English thinks the motivation behind my videos is financial, which is funny because on average I make just anywhere from $300 to $500 per month from Google AdSense. And considering that some of the videos I make take multiple days to create based on the amount of research I do, it really isn't a financially lucrative use of my time. I could make more money working part-time at Panda Express. Yes, my videos are monetized because I figure why the hell not? I work hard on these videos, so why not get something back? Who knows? Maybe if I get enough subscribers, I'll even be able to afford a better video camera. I certainly can't afford a video editor that Rob uses, so I'd say Rob's hair business is doing a lot better than my business, if you could even call it a business. Keep in mind though, even though I do get some money through Google AdSense, my channel and all of its videos are completely free. People watching me don't even need to watch most of the ads, as the majority of them have a skip option on them. Even though I do run a small YouTube channel, I have had plenty of opportunities to sell out. I could have created a Patreon, I could have live streamed and begged for donations, I could have charged for live one-on-one sessions, or I could have even done something like Rob English did and create a website where I offer some information for free as a teaser, but then put the rest of my content behind a paywall. I don't do that though, because I feel people should have access to good information regardless of their financial status. Rob, in his original video and response video, never brings up the fact that he is selling a service for quite a steep fee. He mentions that his research has been published as open source, but he never mentions that he is selling a consultative service that costs from $147 to $297 every 6 months. Now, I do not begrudge him for wanting to charge for a service. Unlike me, he does this for a living, but he has no business accusing me of being in it just for the money, as my content has never cost my viewers a single penny, whereas he does charge his subscribers for a service, and quite a lot. Problem 3. Rob English distorts my experience with finasteride.
Take his own story about how he finally worked up the courage to try oral finasteride.
So I'm not going to show the trash he posted, as it is a cheap shot, but what he's referring to is a comment I made in 2013 where I said finasteride gave me sexual side effects. He then posted a video I made a couple years ago titled Taking the Red Pill to Fight Hair Loss, where I said I started finasteride and I did not get sexual side effects. This does sound like a contradiction, but there's more to the story that Rob isn't saying here. So I intended this video to be an introductory video for my channel. You know, like when you click on my channel, it's the first thing you see. It ended up being too long for that though, so I decided against this and just made it a regular upload. But being an introductory video, I wanted to give people who had just discovered my channel a positive impression about finasteride, so I didn't think that video was an appropriate place to go into detail about my struggles to overcome my own initial fears about taking finasteride. So what I was discussing was my impressions of finasteride after I had accepted the red pill reality of the drug without revisiting the times when I was a sniveling little bitch who was so afraid of pharmaceuticals that I gave myself a nocebo effect. So I wasn't contradicting myself. In fact, I have brought up the fact that I used to be afraid of finasteride in many of my videos. Here's an example. So, any hair loss veteran will tell you that back in the early 2010s, fear-mongering about finasteride was out of control. If you were to go to any forum and ask about finasteride, people would tell you it was the pharmacological equivalent to Russian roulette, and sadly, many people, including myself, bought into the fear-mongering. So what you're implying I'm being deceptive about is actually something I have always been open about. I just didn't feel it was appropriate for my narrative in that particular video to go into my personal weaknesses when I wanted to be inspirational for my viewers. So after accusing me of cherry picking your video, you obviously combed through my videos and even my old social media posts to find whatever contradictions you can, and so you have surely seen enough of my content to know that my history with fighting hair loss is not even that much different than your own history. You even said you were afraid of finasteride and even threw out the prescription of finasteride that was filled for you, and now you admit that fear wasn't warranted, and you even brought up the nocebo effect in your podcast with Paul Saladino, where you point out that people who already have a negative perception of finasteride, just like you and I used to, they're more likely to experience a nocebo effect. So had you taken finasteride back then, despite being afraid, you probably would have went through the exact same thing I did, yet here you are trying to break my balls about it for some reason. Unlike you, I overcame my fear of finasteride, and I have been very open about this whole process. You, on the other hand, still don't use it, despite admitting that the side effects are overblown, and instead attribute all of your gains in maintenance to scalp massages. The point is, though, is that you posted these clips in bad faith and out of context in order to try to discredit me, in order to dilute my very valid criticisms, much of the same way you try to make fun of me for being a personal trainer, as if that means I don't know what I'm talking about, which brings us to Problem 4. Rob English mocks my background while neglecting the fact that he is also an amateur without any professional training or degree in any medical field.
Kevin Mann is, I believe, a personal trainer, a sales rep, and a YouTube personality. Kevin Mann, a personal trainer, then goes on to say this. Now, in Kevin's defense, Ralph Trueb is not a personal trainer. Do you have any real resources to cite, like videos of personal trainers shouting from library dens?
So for some reason, Rob English decides to mock my background as a personal trainer as if there's anything wrong with that, but he also neglects to mention the fact that he is also an amateur without any professional training or degree in any medical field. So Rob continually brings up my professional background as a personal trainer, and yes, it's true. I am certified as a strength and conditioning specialist, certified by the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and I have 7 other fitness-related certifications as well. And I also have a bachelor's degree in kinesiology. This isn't my main line of work anymore, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with being a personal trainer, nor does the fact that I am a personal trainer discredit any of my arguments. I am not an MD and I am not a PhD, but guess what? Neither is Rob English. According to his website, he just happened to get interested in hair loss after his diagnosis, I guess you could say, of androgenetic alopecia, and someone on Reddit suggested he do some research and submit it to peer review. He is a self-made man in the hair loss field, which is fine, and I have pursued a similar path educating myself in hair loss on my own channel, but unlike me, he is primarily an online entrepreneur who sells advice at a steep fee. Because he has published a few articles based on data collected on his subscribers, he has managed to become a medical editor, which he won't let anyone forget. So what is a medical editor exactly? Well, a medical editor receives submitted medical articles and sends them off to peer review. It is not a job that requires any medical training whatsoever. That's not a slight against medical editors, though. I have nothing against people who pursue that line of work, but I think that Rob needs to get off his high horse here and not assume that what he says is more valid than what I say because I'm a personal trainer. That's more than a little arrogant, Rob. Me being a personal trainer doesn't make my arguments wrong any more than Rob English being a sales clerk at 7-Eleven would make his arguments wrong. Arguments can stand on their own based on their merits independent of the person delivering the message. So in the end, this mocking tone towards personal trainers is just another ad hominem attack from Rob English. And besides, what is up with the homophobic implications here? Don't you live in San Francisco, dude? Problem 5. Rob English accuses me of selectively playing clips from his video.
First, I was on Paul Saladino's podcast 2 months ago to talk about hair loss. The conversation spans over 2 hours. It's front-loaded with my story, my
entry into manuscript writing and hair loss research, the genetic and androgenic basis of androgenic alopecia, clinical data supporting DHT reduction, the safety and efficacy of finasteride, and interaction points between hair loss disorders. Later on, we talk about evidence surrounding a few natural interventions, some of my research interests, and a few anecdotes relating to the microbiome and hair loss.
Kevin takes this 2+ hour conversation, truncates my talking points to 10 minutes, and then comments on these selected cuts of me.
What did you do? Play the whole 2-hour plus video and then add my own commentary on top of that? You think my viewers have time for all of that shit? You didn't play my whole video either in your response video, and you even glossed over several of my points, which I'll get to later, but here is a simple reason why I didn't cover the entire interview. It's because most of the stuff you disclosed with Paul Saladino wasn't stuff I cared about or had any contention with. I didn't cover it because it wasn't congruent with what I was critical of in your podcast with him. In fact, I actually did give you credit for many of the parts I agreed with you on.
And that's the drug finasteride, which is a DHT reducer.
So far, he sounds pretty reasonable. In fact, I was downright impressed.
That taking finasteride could have negative effects on performance for males especially.
So Paul Saladino brought up his concerns with suppressing DHT by bringing up typical misconceptions about the hormones, such as saying that DHT might be necessary for male performance and virility. And after this, the whole podcast could have really gone off the whole post-finasteride syndrome deep end. But thankfully, Rob English lays to rest this concern, as we'll see here.
DHT is a pretty important hormone. It has neurosteroid properties. It has developmental properties. But in adulthood, it seems like that hormone, at least with the evidence so far, is less necessary.
Rob English also does a good job of debunking other misconceptions about finasteride. So specifically, as you can see, I actually agreed with you on the role of finasteride in treating androgenetic alopecia and the fact that the side effects are overblown and largely due to a nocebo effect. However, the bulk of your video was not on pharmacologic therapy, it was on scalp massage and Paul Saladino's ridiculous claims about the carnivore diet, and that was the content I was most interested in critiquing. My video was already over an hour long, and I have respect for my viewers' time, so I wasn't going to cover stuff you went over that I didn't find contentious or simply didn't interest me. Problem number 6. Rob English falsely believes that telogen effluvium is the most common cause of hair loss, but then goes on to say that everybody has androgenetic alopecia, which doesn't make any sense, and it isn't true.
Because there's an even bigger problem with what Kevin Mann just described, and that's his own definition of telogen effluvium.
Now, telogen effluvium is the second most common cause of hair loss, albeit a distant second, but is defined as a temporary loss of hair due to extreme stress, such as the loss of a loved one, or trauma due to surgery or injury.
I disagree with Kevin Mann's definition of telogen effluvium, and so do the world's top hair loss researchers. Take Ralph Trueb, who wrote a 2016 review on telogen effluvium and defined the condition as any pathologically increased shedding of normal telogen hairs of greater than 20%. Trueb also described telogen effluvium as, by far, the commonest cause of hair loss. In other words, not a distant second to androgenic alopecia, as Kevin so definitively states. So everybody's got the ingredients for pattern hair loss, more or less, but not everybody lives in such a way that's going to accelerate its onset.
Rob spends over 18 minutes on this part of the video, so he is really invested in these bizarre ideas. Rob English bases these outrageous claims on a paper by Dr. Trueb titled, quote, "Telogen effluvium, is there a need for a new classification?" unquote. So just by reading the title, you can see that Dr. Trueb is proposing an entirely new definition of telogen effluvium and not the medically accepted definition of telogen effluvium. And that indeed is what his paper is all about. If you look at the standard medically accepted definitions for telogen effluvium, for example from Stedman's Medical Dictionary, you find that it is defined as, quote, increased transient shedding of normal club hairs by premature development of telogen in anagen follicles resulting from various kinds of stress, including childbirth, shock, drug intake, cessation of an oral contraceptive, fever, dieting with marked weight loss, unquote. Or if you look at the WebMD definition of telogen effluvium, they say it is the second most common cause of hair loss, which is what I said in my video, but Rob said it is wrong just because Dr. Trueb said so. It's all there, black and white, clear as crystal. You see that WebMD notes that the causes of telogen effluvium include childbirth, vaccinations, crash dieting, physical trauma such as being in a car crash, and having surgery. So in short, telogen effluvium is normally defined as a self-limited, temporary, but severe shedding of hairs due to severe triggering factors. It is not defined as a normal biological process occurring in everyone. That would be just the telogen phase of the hair cycles that we all experience, including people who don't even have hair loss. Effluvium is a Latin word for flowing. So when you have telogen effluvium, the hair is literally flowing off your head. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? And it is. In its editorial, Dr. Trua proposes that the definition of telogen effluvium should be expanded to include more minor episodes of hair shedding, including even seasonal hair shedding due to exposure to ultraviolet light from the sun. But this is his own idea, and this has not been widely accepted by the medical community outside of Rob English, I guess. So Rob may want to redefine telogen effluvium in this way to meet his own agenda so that he could say that everyone is having telogen effluvium all the time. But if you accept this, then telogen effluvium is no longer a disease because everybody has it, and it dilutes the meaning of the term to the point that it becomes meaningless, and it obfuscates the actual clinical diagnoses of telogen effluvium based on the accepted medical definition. So how can doctors even make this diagnosis anymore if everybody has it? If you get to define your own medical terms any way you want, you can prove anything, and that's exactly what Rob is doing here. He's not talking about telogen effluvium in the normal sense of how it's presently defined. He's basing his definition off an editorial that proposes we expand the definition to the point that telogen effluvium's definition becomes completely meaningless. If that isn't enough, he even makes an even more outrageous claim right after this that everybody has androgenic alopecia as well.
So everybody's got the ingredients for pattern hair loss, more or less, but not everybody lives in such a way that's going to accelerate its onset.
Rob, you're claiming androgenic alopecia occurs in everybody, but this is just not the medically orthodox view. Androgenic alopecia is a genetic disorder, so we wouldn't expect everybody to have the androgenic alopecia genes, just in the same way we wouldn't expect everybody to have brown eyes. There are numerous examples of people in their old age with full heads of hair. Even people in their 90s can be Norwood 1s. Then there are people your age or younger who are full-blown Norwood 7s compared to you, who is a Norwood 1, despite claiming to have started balding at 17, yet still having no signs of hair loss at all in your 30s from scalp massages, apparently. The fact is, though, that plenty of people never ever have to worry about hair loss and never will have to worry about hair loss, and that's not fair in the slightest, but that's genetics for you. Different studies estimate the prevalence of androgenic alopecia in men to be from anywhere from 50 to 67% of the population of men. And it's true that it gets more frequent with age, but this is only in people who have the genes for androgenic alopecia to begin with, which isn't 100% of the population. So this is really an extreme view that you have, and it's not based on science, but just speculation. There have been over 200 genes associated with androgenic alopecia, so it's definitely a genetic condition that is not present in the whole population. You did mention genetics in your video, but you made the distinction that genetics don't cause androgenic alopecia, but they just accelerate it.
And genetics do play a role in the rate of miniaturization per cycle.
Again, this is not an orthodox medical opinion, and it leads to your idea that stress is making androgenic alopecia worse than it ever was, which brings us to the next problem. Problem 7. Rob English claims that androgenic alopecia is rapidly getting more frequent.
Here, Kevin is summarizing a part of the podcast where I suggest that the prevalence of androgenic alopecia might be increasing.
The initial example he used to show this in his Paul Saladino podcast compared two separate studies from China, where one showed a 2.9% prevalence of hair loss in one study and 60% prevalence in another one 10 years later. I objected to these studies on the basis that it's implausible that the incidence of hair loss could increase nearly 20-fold in just 10 years, and to his credit, Rob English did concede this point.
The 2010 number is from a study measuring cosmetic degrees of baldness in China-based students. The other number is from a study on China-based students reporting whether they have hair loss. These aren't perfectly comparable metrics, so Kevin isn't totally wrong to flag this. I could have used better data to illustrate my point.
But to save face, I guess, he decides to bring up another study, this time from Good Korea, which he didn't mention in his original video, but better late than never, I guess.
We actually do have data corroborating this. A 4-year study on 13,000 men in South Korea found that after adjusting for age, marital status, education, monthly household income, smoking, and work schedule, men working more than 52 hours per week were significantly more likely to be filling prescriptions for oral medications for hair loss.
So anyways, in this study, the researchers looked at about 13,000 Korean male workers who were not on finasteride in 2013. They then asked the same workers if they were on oral alopecia medication, meaning finasteride, 4 years later in 2017. They then looked at differences between the subjects who were on finasteride and those who weren't after 4 years. One of the factors that increased the possibility of going on finasteride was long working hours. In fact, those with the longest working hours were the most likely to go on finasteride. So the study authors are claiming that none of these 13,000 workers started off with androgenic alopecia, but after 4 years, the ones working the longest hours were more likely to develop androgenic alopecia. So pretty strong evidence that the stress of working long hours causes you to go bald, right? Well, not so fast. You can't assume that none of the 13,000 workers in 2013 had androgenic alopecia to begin with. And you may ask, well, Kevin, why weren't they on finasteride back then? And the answer is because the study specifically excluded anyone on finasteride. So since androgenic alopecia without treatment gets worse and worse the longer it is left untreated, we would expect some of those 13,000 men had androgenic alopecia but weren't on treatment at the time the study began. But some of them were bound to get further progression of their androgenic alopecia over the course of 4 years and end up using finasteride. But you also may say, yeah, but Kevin, if you worked long hours, you were more likely to end up on finasteride. Well, this is a classic example of correlation does not equal causation fallacy, because another way to look at this data is not that long work hours made people go bald, but rather that bald people had jobs with longer work hours to begin with. In fact, the strongest risk factor for going on finasteride found in the entire study was the combination of very long work hours combined with low household income, where the risk of ending up on finasteride was 3.82 times greater than someone working normal hours. So having a low-paying job and working long hours was associated with baldness. So you might think this could be due to the stress associated with having a shittier job. But as it turns out, though, there is a lot of data showing that physical attractiveness has a lot to do with how good of a job you get and what kind of income you can make. It's unfair, but life isn't fair. All factors being equal, physical attractiveness gives you a competitive advantage, I should say, in getting a job. And for men, one of the biggest markers of physical attractiveness is a full head of hair. So if bald men are more likely to end up in low-paying jobs than men with full heads of hair, this could well explain why more men with these low-paying jobs end up on finasteride, because they were more likely to have androgenic alopecia to begin with. This interpretation is backed up by the fact that the only age group where long work hours made a statistical difference was the 30 to 39 year age group, which is a group where physical attractiveness is still considered to be a big asset. So this one study certainly isn't proof of anything, and Rob's thesis is based on a false premise that telogen effluvium, which is stress-related hair loss, is the most common cause of hair loss, which we already have established is factually inaccurate unless you decide to redefine telogen effluvium to mean the kind of hair shedding that everybody gets. This Good Korean study doesn't come close to proving his hypothesis, and the fact is there is no good evidence that the incidence of androgenic alopecia is actually increasing in recent years. Remember,
a confident delivery is not synonymous with accurate information.
Problem 8. Rob English quibbles with me about scientific questions like how important the type 1 5-AR enzyme is in the hair follicle.
Or take this clip of Kevin Mann explaining why he thinks that dutasteride is more powerful than finasteride at fighting androgenic alopecia.
In fact, there was a meta-analysis out of China from last year that showed in 3 studies involving 576 patients that dutasteride was more effective than finasteride with similar adverse effects over 24 weeks. This improved efficacy is often erroneously attributed to the fact that dutasteride suppresses the type 2 and type 1 5A reductase enzyme, when in reality it's probably just because dutasteride suppresses more of the type 2 enzyme compared to finasteride, since the type 2 enzyme is what is active on the scalp.
It is a confidently delivered statement by Kevin, but it's one that's not necessarily accurate.
So here, Rob English disagrees with my statement that the greater efficacy of dutasteride versus finasteride is not due to the blocking of the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme. To be clear, finasteride blocks the type 2 5-AR enzyme, while dutasteride blocks both the type 1 and type 2 5-AR enzymes. I never said that the type 1 enzyme wasn't present in the hair follicles, rather I just said it was the type 2 enzyme that is the important factor in controlling hair loss. Rob brings up one of the studies included in the meta-analysis that used a lower than standard dose of dutasteride, namely 0.1 milligram daily versus the normal dose of 0.5 milligram daily, as well as a higher than standard dose of finasteride, namely 5 milligrams daily versus the normal dose for hair loss of 1 milligram daily. And in this study, the effects of the drugs on hair growth were comparable, although the DHT suppression was slightly less with dutasteride at 32% versus finasteride at 41%. However, Rob jumps to the conclusion that somehow the type 1 isoenzyme suppressed by dutasteride plays an important role in dutasteride's effect, but there is no evidence in the study for that. For all we know, it was the type 2 suppression with dutasteride that caused hair growth, just like the type 2 suppression caused hair growth with finasteride. This is not a good study to compare DHT suppression of the two drugs anyways, because they're not comparing the drugs at a dose that they're standardly prescribed at. They're comparing a larger than normal dosage of finasteride versus a lower than normal dose of dutasteride for what is typically prescribed for hair loss. But worse for Rob's thesis that the type 1 enzyme is important for hair loss, there is nothing in the study that can assess the relative effects of dutasteride on the type 1 versus the type 2 isoenzyme. In fact, Rob even brings up previous studies that showed that blocking the type 1 isoenzyme had no effect on hair growth, which supports the statement that I made that dutasteride's greater efficacy has nothing to do with the type 1 isoenzyme.
As earlier studies hadn't shown hair-related benefits from those using drugs that only targeted type 1 5-alpha reductase.
I know it's present on the scalp, but that doesn't mean it has anything to do with hair loss. There are other potential reasons that may explain dutasteride's superiority over finasteride, such as its much longer half-life than finasteride, 5 weeks versus about 5 hours, which would give it an obvious more potent and prolonged effect in blocking the type 2 enzyme compared to finasteride. But the bottom line is, I was giving my opinion about why dutasteride suppresses more DHT than finasteride, and I excluded the type 1 isoenzyme as being a factor, as there is no good evidence for it being a causative factor in androgenic alopecia. In theory, it's possible. It just hasn't been proven yet, and I refuse to make objective statements based purely on theory without any evidence. So in this case, it is Rob who is being overconfident about the data. He's just pointing to the existence of the type 1 5-AR on the scalp without any evidence. He's saying, see, this is proof that the type 1 plays a role in dutasteride's efficacy when the existing data says it doesn't play a role. Remember, a confident presentation does not equal a strong argument. Problem 9. Rob English tries to defend the BLØDFLÜW theory because his main motivation is selling massage therapy on his website.
In the podcast, I reiterate the hypothesis presented by the investigators across the 4 intramuscular Botox studies, that Botox injections into these scalp perimeter muscles might unclamp pinched arterial branches that indirectly supply blood to the top of the scalp. Kevin Mann has a different take on the Botox data.
The bottom line with Botox, though, is that there is some evidence that Botox may have a mild effect on hair growth, but not through relaxing muscles. Rather, what causes it is through the decreasing of negative growth factors like TGF-beta-1. So this Botox data is not the supposed proof of the scalp tension theory that everyone, including Rob English, thinks and wishes it were.
Kevin Mann is sort of right, but he's actually not referring to the 4 studies testing intramuscular injections of Botox. Rather, he's referring to a study that injected Botox intradermally, directly into balding regions.
So he makes this big argument that the intradermal injection of Botox having an effect doesn't negate his theory that Botox works by relaxing the muscles of the scalp, since he was talking about the intramuscular studies, which he thinks I ignored, even though I went over them in detail in my video on Botox, which he linked in the description. He goes into great detail about how far intramuscular Botox injections can diffuse in the scalp to make his point. He acts like I'm crazy for not considering the possibility that Botox works by relaxing the muscles and thus allowing more blood flow to the scalp. Well, the investigators who did the intradermal Botox study disagree with him. They say, quote, Previous studies reported the use of intramuscular Botox injections to treat androgenetic alopecia without elucidating the exact underlying mechanism. Considering the diffusion of the injected liquid Botox and scalp anatomy, even the intramuscular injection may indirectly inhibit the secretion of TGF-beta1 from dermal papilla cells in the hair bulb, unquote. So basically, this study is saying that Botox works by decreasing the levels of TGF-beta1, which is a negative growth factor, and that the muscle relaxing effects of Botox are not what causes it to regrow hair. So Rob spends a lot of time talking about how far Botox diffuses in the skin, and he makes an unjustified comparison about the intramuscular injections being more efficacious than the intradermal injections, even though the studies don't use comparable methodology, and the only valid way to compare these two types of deliveries of Botox would be to do a randomized controlled study comparing the two techniques directly. But despite all this argumentation, Rob ends up concluding anyways that we don't know the exact mechanism of how Botox works.
In any case, Kevin does make a fair point about researchers not yet knowing the exact mechanisms by which Botox intramuscularly can improve hair counts. It's true, we just don't know.
Then makes a snide remark that my claim that maneuvers to increase BLØDFLÜW, like increasing the cardiac output with exercise or decreasing the peripheral vascular resistance with vasodilator drugs, won't work because of muscle clamping blocking BLØDFLÜW. After all, if BLØDFLÜW were the reason Botox promoted hair growth, then why wouldn't other things that improve BLØDFLÜW promote it, such as blood pressure medication or cardiovascular exercise?
Because vascular networks constricted by physical impediments, such as muscular contractions, would not respond to a vasodilator or exercise.
Well, increasing cardiac output via exercise or vasodilation, like I talked about, actually does lead to increased blood flow in the arteries despite their caliper. But there are more serious problems with Rob's BLØDFLÜW theory overall. The scalp is one of the most vascular parts of the body. Ask any emergency room doctor what part of the body bleeds the most if there is a laceration, and the answer is always going to be the scalp. One reason for this is that the scalp arterial supply is extremely redundant. There are 6 different arteries on each side of the scalp, so 12 arteries in total, as you can see here. These all supply blood to the scalp. Because of the numerous interconnections between these arteries, as you can also see here, the scalp is not dependent on any particular artery because they are all interconnected. So even if one were completely blocked off, the blood flow would just increase in the other arteries, and it would make no difference to the overall blood supply in the scalp. Even worse for his theory that somehow the muscles are clamping down on these arteries is the fact that the arteries actually travel in the fascia, which is the connective layer that overlies the muscles of the head. The arteries don't travel through the muscles, they travel above the muscles. So muscle contractions would not be a factor to begin with because the arteries do not run through or under the muscles. You can even see these arteries just under the skin, like in this photo of the superficial temporal artery here. I mean, that is why it is called the superficial temporal artery, because it is located just under the skin. If you were a personal trainer who had studied anatomy like me, Rob, then maybe you would have already known this. Rob also ignores the point I made about the Sinclair study, which he cited in his original video and which I rebutted. The Sinclair study showed decreased oxygen levels in the scalps of bald men, but rather than this being due to a primary problem with BLØDFLÜW, this phenomenon is most easily explained by the loss of capillary beds that occurs with balding, because with the lack of hair follicles, there are going to be fewer capillaries supplying blood to them. If blood supply was really being impaired in balding scalps, then why don't we see necrosis of the skin in men going bald? He also ignores the transplant data from Dr. Orentreich, where hairs on men with androgenetic alopecia were transplanted from areas of high scalp tension to areas of low tension, and he showed that the hairs would still miniaturize at the same rate. Dr. Orentreich also did the opposite experiment, where normal hairs from the back of the head were transplanted to areas of high scalp tension, and there was no miniaturization of the transplanted hairs. In fact, there is a name for this procedure. It's called a hair transplant, and they work because the hairs that are transplanted are genetically programmed to have resistance to androgens and less 5-AR activity, which is why they don't miniaturize despite being in areas of high scalp tension. I have had 2 hair transplants, and they wouldn't have worked if the scalp tension / BLØDFLÜW theory was correct. In addition to this, even though I brought this point up in the original video he responded to, he didn't mention how I pointed out that if scalp tension were real, why do people lose hairs in patterns different from the areas of scalp tension, such as diffuse thinners or people with retrograde alopecia? These causes are still androgenic, and in fact, diffuse thinning and retrograde alopecia are still forms of androgenic alopecia that can be treated with 5-AR inhibitors like finasteride, but Rob English offers no explanation for this discrepancy. These causes of androgenetic alopecia are not as common, but the difference is their hair follicles are just genetically programmed so that the hairs that are more sensitive to DHT and have more 5-AR activity are in different places, hence why conventional treatments like finasteride still work for them. So just because hair loss occurs usually in areas where the scalp tension is high does not mean that scalp tension is what is causing hair loss. This is yet another correlation equals causation fallacy. So after making his arguments for the BLØDFLÜW theory, Rob says something like, well, why are we even arguing about this? It's not that important. Well, actually, from Rob's point of view, it is really important that the blood flow theory needs to be true because he uses it to justify his scalp massages as a treatment for hair loss. Remember, Rob says that scalp massages have maintained his hair for the last 13 years. From my point of view, the evidence against the BLØDFLÜW theory is important because it shows that scalp massages would not be an effective treatment for androgenic alopecia. So the BLØDFLÜW theory is really just something that was proposed to support unproven treatments like scalp massages and the grow band, which even Rob English thinks is bullshit, and of course I agree, but the problem is that the grow band's premise is based on the same flawed theory behind the scalp massages, which Rob English claims saved his hair and he promotes to other people. He even says on his website that you can treat hair loss without drugs, so it's obvious he's competent enough in scalp massages that he's willing to build a business which promotes it. He's clever though, because unlike a lot of other snake oil salesmen who just promote their magical therapies, he mixes in just enough legit science to give a veneer of legitimacy to his sales push. You even see HairGuard doing this because as critical as I have been of his products, he actually does have a few decent science-based videos on his channel, so Rob English is really not as different from HairGuard as he likes to believe. Just because Rob English is pro-finasteride and has material on his website that is true does not give him a free pass to promote whatever bullshit he wants to promote, like scalp massages. On the contrary, it does more harm than good, because when you have people who look like they know what they're talking about promoting worthless techniques and products, it makes them seem more believable. Just think about this. If people were to promote something like, say, colloidal silver as a treatment for cancer, what would do more harm? If a televangelist promoted it or a doctor? Obviously, the doctor would do more harm, since there is a good chance that people may believe the doctor, so it's a good thing that Rob English is just a medical editor. Problem 10. Rob English claims that microneedling is healthy for the scalp and not just a means of improving drug delivery. So sort of as an aside, he brings up microneedling as a hair loss treatment, and he says it works by causing inflammation, which supposedly improves hair growth through the promotion of growth factors. But we know inflammation is a process that leads to fibrosis.
Kevin is right that inflammation is a process that can lead to fibrosis, but this relationship is biphasic, it's dose dependent. With smaller wounds, like those from microneedling, punctures often barely penetrate beyond the epidermis. And in these cases, wounds can actually do the opposite. They can elicit growth factors to help promote angiogenesis and remodel skin that is already scarred.
Rob English points out that there is a study looking at microneedling alone, and that microneedling is actually a fantastic treatment. I did a video where I covered this study, and I'll go ahead and link that below if you want to hear my thoughts in great detail, but to sum up my opinions on microneedling, I think that it is overrated and that the evidence that it can do anything by itself is weak, and at best, it may just help improve the absorption of minoxidil, which is fine, but I don't think it's worth the pain. But Rob's main contention with me on microneedling is that I expressed the concern that microneedling could have long-term deleterious effects on the scalp by causing inflammation and scarring. He counters this by saying that very gentle microneedling actually can accelerate wound healing, and he claims that most microneedling is like that. However, we know that the studies done on microneedling that yielded positive results, like this study on the Follicum microneedling device for instance, show that microneedling was very painful with average pain levels of 6.4 on a 0 to 10 scale. In another study of microneedling, it is noted in the methods section that, quote, the treatment endpoints were hemorrhage and redness, unquote. So in many studies showing results from microneedling, the microneedling technique is painful and it's even bloody. So the way microneedling was applied in these studies is not the same way Rob is advocating it, where he says you could just be like all soft and gentle like. No, on the contrary, these subjects drew blood with their microneedling devices. So yes, I do think since we lack long-term studies of the safety of microneedling, it's not clear clear if the procedure is safe long term, and in any case, it is definitely not an essential component of a hair loss prevention stack. Since microneedling is so popular and long-term studies are lacking, my point is that the burden of proof that long-term microneedling is safe and that it doesn't cause scar tissue has not yet been made, and even still, microneedling hasn't been proven effective as a standalone treatment, though it might help with minoxidil absorption. I don't begrudge anyone who wants to use microneedling, but in my opinion, it is overhyped and not necessary. Minoxidil without microneedling is good enough for most people, and if you are a non-responder minoxidil, there are better alternatives to cutting up your scalp, like using tretinoin, which increases sulfotransferase activity in the scalp, which can turn a minoxidil non-responder into a responder. Problem 11. Rob English claims the carnivore diet cures hair loss.
In the next portion of the podcast, Paul Saladino and I discuss some of the anecdotes surrounding carnivore diets and hair health. While this might sound out of left field, Paul Saladino's research interests actually revolve around animal-based dieting. In any case, context matters here as it does throughout the entire podcast, and we're now 90 minutes into the podcast before we get to this conversation. I start to talk about some members of our community who had tried finasteride, failed to see hair regrowth, ended up quitting, and then later adopted a carnivore diet for purposes unrelated to hair health, but inadvertently saw what they described as significant improvements to androgenic alopecia.
So Rob claims that all his statements about the carnivore diet were qualified by him saying that these are all just theories, none of it's verified, etc., etc. He claims that he never claimed that the carnivore diet is valid for treating hair loss, and he says all of his statements came with disclaimers.
But again, this entire discussion is contextualized with disclaimers on data quality, speculation, and mechanistic versus clinical interventional data.
However, Rob, even if these words didn't leave your lips, the general impression you gave was that you agreed with Paul Saladino claiming that his worthless supplement could possibly help with hair loss. I say that because you had many opportunities to call him out on his bullshit and you didn't do so, so implicitly it looked like you were agreeing with him. Not only that, you even went on the carnivore diet yourself before the podcast and brought it up to suck up to Paul Saladino, who is a carnivore diet promoter. So I'm saying this based on what you disappointingly didn't say rather than what you did say. If I were watching a podcast between two historians and one denied the Holocaust, I would hold the other one accountable for it if he didn't call him out for it as well. My point though is that sometimes what people don't say is stronger than what people do say. Also, just think about it. You said yourself that you wrote several disclaimers in the comments that the carnivore diet doesn't help with hair loss, so clearly I wasn't the only one who got that impression that you believe the carnivore diet can help with hair loss.
I went into the comments, and for any thread heading in this direction, I chimed in to remind everybody that the carnivore diet should not be employed as a first-line defense for androgenic alopecia, that we're diving deep into speculative territory here, that I am not endorsing the carnivore diet in any way for the treatment of any hair loss disorder, and that people need to seek well-studied treatments.
I'm glad you clarified in your response video, but despite your cherry-picked disclaimers, it certainly wasn't clear that this was your position during the podcast because you didn't take enough opportunities to challenge Paul Saladino's claims. He even claims anecdotally that he knows people who lost hair as a consequence of following a vegan diet, but during that part, you didn't challenge him at all and just let him get away with that claim, yet later on, you entertained the possibility that the carnivore diet may help with hair loss, and the fact that you add a bunch of disclaimers to it doesn't negate the fact that you were very credulous in your interview with Paul Saladino. Personally, for what it's worth, I believe you now when you tell me you don't think the carnivore diet helps with hair loss, but I do believe you were trying to tell Paul Saladino things he wanted to hear. I mean, why did you show all these anecdotes if you don't believe the carnivore diet helps with hair loss? I'm sorry, but your video did make you look very pro-carnivore, as you had a great opportunity to explain why something like the carnivore diet couldn't help with hair loss, but you didn't take it. Instead, you take this agnostic, we're just all asking questions here approach, when really you should be demanding a burden of proof. Especially since Paul Saladino says without a shadow of a doubt that he absolutely thinks his organ meat supplements will help with hair loss. You've given negative reviews of products whose manufacturers have said the exact same things about their products, like HairGuard and Nutrafol, so why did you pussyfoot around Paul Saladino? I think it's because you wanted to tap into his larger audience and not make any waves, so even with your position on the carnivore diet clarified and me accepting that position, I still think you are a smarmy opportunist who accuses other people of having an agenda, but you are willing to violate your own principles and integrity when it's beneficial for you. Fact is, you didn't disagree with a single point Paul Saladino made. On the other hand, Paul called you out for your fecal transplant obsession, so as bad as Paul looks in this video, you came across worse. Problem 12. Rob argues with me whether photos in a medical study show typical versus best responses.
Well, guess what? This was one patient selected to represent results of the best responders out of 1,000 people.
So he is assuming that the researchers here showed the very best example of finasteride's response. That's not necessarily so. Most scientists would show a typical response in their papers.
Here, Kevin Mann is claiming that the photo I'm showing on this slide of a finasteride patient probably doesn't represent a best response, it represents a typical response.
So Rob makes a big point out of the fact that in the paper he cited, there was a figure that showed photos of a responder to finasteride, and that Rob called this the absolute best response that the investigators saw with finasteride. He backs this up by noting that there was another figure in the paper that showed what the investigators classified as a moderate response. I said in my video that investigators usually pick out a typical example of response when they publish a paper, and they don't show the very best response. They don't try to bias the reader by publishing a photo of a subject who had a response that was so good that it was an outlier. Rob twists my words and says this photo is not a photo showing a best response when I said very best response. He apparently thinks that researchers are trying to mislead the readers of these studies by publishing figures that don't represent the actual results of their trials. So if the researcher published a figure showing a good response and a moderate response, I would expect they would publish a typical example of a good response and a moderate response, while Rob apparently thinks the good response photo must be the absolute best responder that they had in the study, even if this response was not typical of the good responders in the study. So maybe this disagreement is somewhat semantical, but I don't think Rob really understood what I was saying, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't think he is trying to say that the researchers are purposely publishing misleading figures, but that seems to be what he is implying here. It's not even that big of a point, so I don't know why he decided to spend so much time on this one minor issue. So, okay, cool story, bro. Let's move on. Problem 13. Rob English's anecdotes about anecdotes.
I wholeheartedly disagree with Kevin Mann about anecdotes. Anecdotes do belong in serious scientific discussions.
So after saying that all his talk about the carnivore diet came with disclaimers insisting that there is no evidence that the carnivore diet can stop hair loss, he starts out the section of the video by summarizing his anecdotes on the carnivore diet and says,
Hair loss, improvements to hair graying, and these are anecdotes that we should not ignore.
quote, "These are anecdotes that we should not ignore," unquote. So despite saying that he slapped disclaimers on everything he said,
But again, this entire discussion is contextualized with disclaimers on data quality, speculation, and mechanistic versus clinical interventional data.
clearly that's not true, because here, not only is there no disclaimer, but he insists that his anecdotes are such strong evidence for the carnivore diet that we can't even ignore it. So there's no doubt that Rob is supporting the carnivore diet here, so it's no wonder his viewers and myself had the same impression, so much so he had to write several disclaimers to clarify what his real position was. So when Rob really gets into it with Dr. Saladino and his meat fetish, as well as his hate boner for vegans, he starts pulling up a lot of anecdotes of people who had lots of meat and had some hair regrowth. I commented that these anecdotes don't matter and that anecdotes don't belong in a serious discussion. This got Rob all hot and bothered because he loves anecdotes, and he justifies this love because of certain accidental discoveries in medicine, like seeing hair growth when people first got minoxidil, or the classic example that he doesn't mention is that penicillin was discovered because some mold grew in a petri dish. Yeah, these are some great anecdotes, but these are not representative of most anecdotes. In fact, the times when anecdotes lead to breakthroughs in research are exceptionally rare. In fact, most anecdotes are pretty useless. They are an easy way for investigators to publish papers without doing much work. Also, anecdotes tend to distort science because, for example, no one would publish a case report of someone with androgenetic alopecia who got finasteride and then had hair regrowth. However, if someone took finasteride and claimed their hair all fell out because of it, that would get published. The point is, though, is that case reports, which are just published anecdotes, anecdotes tend to emphasize things that happen rarely, not commonly. So if one person eats organ meats and grows their hair, then that gets shown by people like Rob English in his talk with Paul Saladino, even if 100 other people ate organ meats and had no results at all. I'm not saying that anecdotes are completely worthless, but they occupy the bottom rung of the hierarchy of scientific evidence and are weaponized to deny science all the time. For example, anecdotal reports from expert scientists like Jenny McCarthy claim that vaccines gave her child autism, and this claim was spread far and wide until the whole link between vaccines and autism was debunked by well-designed studies. And yet, despite this, people are still claiming that vaccine caused autism, contrary to all the scientific evidence that says otherwise. Another problem with anecdotes is that you can always find an anecdote that claims the opposite of what you're claiming. In fact, on a hunch, I went ahead to search if I could find any anecdotes of people claiming the carnivore diet caused hair loss, and lo and behold, I found dozens of results right away. So anecdotes can be used to justify just about anything. Just because anecdotes sometimes turn out to be true doesn't make them valuable evidence. So that's why anecdotes are the lowest level of evidence and why they don't belong in a serious scientific discussion, while randomized control studies are the highest. So I stick by my point that anecdotes do not belong in a serious scientific discussion because they are misleading more often than they are helpful. So Rob is just trying to justify his pulling up a bunch of anecdotes on the carnivore diet to butter up Paul Saladino's ridiculous claims about organ supplements stopping hair loss, and I called him out on this. So Rob's response is to say that anecdotes are important, and he brings up some anecdotes that did turn out to be important, but the thing about those anecdotes is that they were later tested and verified using stronger scientific evidence like controlled trials. Until anecdotes are validated, we should show some skepticism at them, but you didn't show any skepticism in your podcast because you were trying to suck up to Paul Saladino. So what's the point of defending anecdotes when you admit you can't really prove anything with them? Anecdotes are just anecdotal. Anyone can claim anything about anything based on just anecdotes, so your discussion with Paul Saladino about organ meats treating hair loss is based on nothing but anecdotes and therefore not a serious scientific discussion. It was just you pandering to him to take advantage of his larger audience. Your podcast was immensely disappointing. It was anti-scientific, and as low as your standards already are, dare I say, I even think it was beneath you, and that is why I made a reaction video to it. Problem 14. We hear a lot of shit about shit.
Kevin Mann doesn't attempt to explain the hypothesis that I present to Paul Saladino about these anecdotes. Instead, here's how he describes it.
Here he starts speculating about the role of gut bacteria. He says gut bacteria has an influence on DHT and androgens, and he goes on and on and on about the gut microflora biome. So let's get to the real shitty part about his video, where he talks about fecal transplants. Well, I guess the reason I didn't go too in-depth into his theory about fecal transplants is because I don't have a scat fetish. In all seriousness though, I didn't have anything to say about it because what he's proposing is purely speculative and not backed by strong research. He was basing this on mice studies, and I don't really have to comment on that because Paul Saladino did the job for me by pointing out the very obvious flaw that the carbohydrates mice were fed in that study were most likely just pure sucrose, which isn't reflective of the type of diet people would eat. And even if it were, we're talking about fucking rodent shit here, so until you find some people willing to accept fecal transplants, I don't consider anything you're talking about to be applicable to any real-life situation regarding hair loss. I almost didn't want to talk about it in my video at all, but I did think it was funny watching Paul Saladino get bored and start doing neck stretches and trying to keep from falling asleep. I also think it was funny watching your reaction while Paul totally ripped apart your hypothesis by pointing out the obvious flaws in the study. Now, Rob wiggles out of this by once again bringing up some anecdotes looking at a gut dysbiosis and alopecia areata, which of course is completely unrelated to androgenic alopecia, and one case of actual androgenic alopecia. But again, these are just anecdotes, and there are no clinical human studies on using fecal transplantation in this way. I'm sorry, I just didn't find this part of the podcast to be interesting, so I didn't bother with a detailed commentary on it, because I think the evidence as it stands now is too preliminary, but it wasn't the main point of contention with the podcast to begin with. If you can prove moving shit from one person to the next regrows hair, then by all means sign me up. But until then, I think I'll focus on upcoming treatments backed by stronger evidence. Now, To be fair, I did gloss over his one solitary case of using fecal transplants in androgenetic alopecia in the anecdote he stated, but again, this was just one case study, so hardly strong evidence, and he concentrated most of the discussion on alopecia areata. But I'll admit, I probably should have mentioned that case as well. Who knows, maybe Paul Saladino's constant yawning maybe drift off for a moment, but in any case, I have addressed it now. It's not good evidence, and it doesn't prove anything, so let's go ahead and move on. Final words. So in Rob's summary, he once again brings up the monetization of my channel and says that since YouTube is the only way to access my content, that means I must be financially motivated since I don't have any means of people accessing my content that doesn't involve my monetized YouTube channel. Well, the reason why I don't have any other social media platforms is because I have a life outside of social media. I use YouTube because it is a platform I am familiar and comfortable with, and I monetize it because it is a way of me getting some compensation without forcing my viewers to pay any money. That doesn't change my intentions for the channel, but if I am given an option to earn a little money while doing something I enjoy, even the trivial amounts I get, then why the hell wouldn't I elect that option? I'd be stupid not to. I could say confidently that out of the tens of thousands of people who have seen my content though, not a single one of them has ever paid a single cent for it. Can you say the same thing about all of your content, Rob? Rob says that the only way to contact me is through my YouTube channel, but my followers know that I go out of my way to try to respond to as many comments as I possibly can, and a lot of the questions actually require research on my part, yet I answer them anyways because I value discourse and I enjoy and I respect my viewers enough that I want to give them any help that I possibly can. I sometimes spend more time with the comment section than I do on my videos, in fact, and I get no monetary compensation for that at all. This response video you made was 72 minutes long, and not once when discussing your content did you mention the fact that your viewers need to pay for a subscription service in order to view the majority of your content. Sure, you may have some open source articles and PDFs available for free, but the bulk of your content is behind a paywall, and you never once mentioned this while at the same time accusing me of being financially motivated just because I have a few ads up that people can skip. Also, I think you're misinterpreting the thrust of my channel here. I have many videos talking about speculative and future treatments about hair loss that are currently in development, and many of them I have spoken of enthusiastically. I absolutely welcome innovations to hair loss therapies, but you have to remember here, we're dealing with one of the biggest scam industries the world has ever seen, so our approach whenever someone tells us something works, whether it be a grow band, Nutrafol, or the scalp massage programs you're charging for, our first impression should always be skepticism. It doesn't matter how nice the idea may sound on paper, we should still be skeptical. I say this because I myself fell for the bullshit you like to promote, and I speak as an advocate for the consumers against the industrial predators who prey upon our desperation, fear, and misery by offering them this kind of false hope. You claim on your channel that hair loss can be treated without drugs, and we know you're talking about scalp massages. Well, guess what, Rob? You're not the first person to promote some sort of gimmick that promises to help with hair growth on the premise of improving BLØDFLÜW to the scalp, and you won't be the last. But you better believe that there will be people like me ready to stand in your way and call you out on your bullshit, even if you try to masquerade as someone who is reasonable and very academic. Simply put, Rob, I'm not falling for your act here, which is why I called you out. Your promotion of disproven gimmicks is irresponsible, it's dangerous, and frankly, considering some of the good content you've made, I think you can do a lot better, but you need to stop pushing fringe theories like trying to change the definition of Telogen Effluvium, and you need to stop promoting gimmicks like scalp massages as being viable hair loss treatments. You debase yourself and your good content by mixing it in with all this bro science bullshit. People are welcome to disagree with me, but it's hard for me to maintain my decorum with you when you threaten me with legal action for just stating my opinion. So I don't feel like I can engage with you anymore on good faith, and at this point, I'd rather just address other topics. So to all of my viewers, I'm very sorry for the lack of activity on my channel for the past few days. I felt I really had to prioritize this response or I'd probably never hear the end of it. So anyways, here it is, and I hope you enjoyed watching it, and more content is coming soon, so until then, God bless.